In the first issue of Political Concepts, Adi suggested, quote, "A concept is neither given nor created, but rather performed or played in the act of conceptualization." So I'm going to try to perform or play an act of conceptualization for the concept cooperation, which is a kind of understanding as a kind of quasi-technical term that appears throughout methodologically individualist philosophy, economic social science, and biology. So here I have this wonderful piece by Candice Lynn, which is sort of envisioning the importance of cooperation in the history of life, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this is going to be a performance in 2 acts, roughly, and I'll play several characters throughout. So one is kind of the conceptual pedagogue or the analyst, conceptual analyst. And then I'll also play the conceptual politician or reformer or engineer. So in Act 1, I first play the pedagogue, and I use game theory to illustrate the scope of a narrow concept of cooperation as a means, which is common in methodologically individualist philosophy, social science, and biology, namely strategic coordination for mutual benefit. So according to this definition, cooperation is a success from the perspective of the individual cooperators. In biology, whatever the replicators are. In economic social sciences, rational agents pursuing their consistent preferences. In moral and political philosophy, the rational or reasonable agents of an imagined social contract. And then in Act 2, I mostly play the conceptual politician, reformer, or engineer, troubling this concept and distinguishing the methodologically individualist, value neutral, or value aggregative conception of cooperation as a means with an ontologically pluralist, normative, political, ethical conception of cooperation as an end, defined as strategic coordination for a common good or in pursuit of a common good. And I understand common good not merely as an aggregation of individual material interests, but crucially kind of shared normative commitments or political goals like justice or sustainability, where like the material meaning of these goals must be constructed collectively in their pursuit and application by cooperators. And the relationship between these goals and the material interests of the cooperators are not always straightforward. So I'll argue that cooperation in this extended, dynamic, multi-scale, normative sense is useful to understand the formation of coalitions to address social, economic, and environmental injustice, as well as environmental problems like climate change or biodiversity loss that have traditionally been conceived by economists as problems of cooperation in that narrow sense. I think while economists are right that these problems require cooperation, they would be wrong to suggest that they're merely problems of strategic coordination for mutual benefit. And particularly, this is because the spatiotemporal scale and complexity of these problems must involve cooperative construction and pursuit of shared goals, which is to say a common good. So I close by suggesting that the Green New Deal is a kind of model of political cooperation in this extended sense. So here begins Act 1. So cooperation in methodologically individualist biology, social science, and philosophy is understood as strategic coordination for mutual benefit. So this is cooperation as a means. And I'll use these games or game theory from economics to illustrate this methodologically individualist concept because it imagines strategic interactions between agential individuals, whether replicators in biology or rational agents in economics or political philosophy. So these interactions are strategic in the minimal sense in which the outcome depends on the behavior of more than one of these agents. And in kind of the evolutionary context in biology, the payoffs represent some concept of fitness or expected offspring, while in rational choice theory, in political philosophy or economics, they represent agents' preferences or utilities. These might be numbers, going back to Zachary's talk, but I'm just to make it super simple, I'm just using purely kind of ordinal ranking. So it's just kind of qualitative here. So before getting into the many limitations of this concept, I'll kind of expound its scope with these three ideal kind of game types: games of pure coordination, the invisible foot, commonly known as the prisoner's dilemma, and symbiosis or joint production, which has been known as the stag hunt, with reference to biology, social science, and moral and political philosophy. So games of pure coordination, these are easy or imagined to be easy cases of cooperation. So like, you don't want to drive on the right side of the road in Japan or Britain, and awkwardness ensues in hallways and sidewalks when one person facing another kind of goes left and the other right, or vice versa. So situations structured like this are called games of pure coordination because individual interests are perfectly aligned and we just need to coordinate on one thing or another. So we either pass on the right or pass on the left. And in cases like this, cooperation is easy, right? Coordination for mutual benefit just involves settling on one or the other as individual interests are aligned. So interestingly, signaling games of pure coordination developed by the philosopher David Lewis were exported to biology and social science to explain the evolution of signaling systems and the establishment of social norms. The game theory supposedly explains why once established norms have a kind of stability. In game theory, they're Nash equilibria, because once you're in one of these equilibria, no individual does better by unilaterally deviating once a convention is achieved. So you're not gonna get a better result by deciding to pass on the left in the United States. So more difficult or imagined to be difficult cases of cooperation of strategic coordination for mutual benefit have the structure of the so-called prisoner's dilemma, where cooperation would benefit both of us relative to mutual defection from a cooperative strategy, but each of us have an individual incentive to defect, since for each of us, our best outcome is the one where the other cooperates and we don't. So situations like this represent what's economist Sam Bowles calls the invisible foot, because unlike Adam Smith's invisible hand, supposedly allowing mutual benefit through pursuit of individual interest, consistent pursuit of individual interest in these cases actually leads to an outcome that's worse for everyone. So while I think there are arguments to show that they might be wrong to do so, economists and moral and political philosophers have often analyzed collective action problems and open access sources and sinks, often mislabeled after Garrett Hardin's infamous tragedy of the commons as the commons, like an open access fishery or the global carbon sink. So they model these as multiplayer versions of this game, where each individual has an incentive to free ride off the contributions of others. But when enough individuals defect, everyone ends up worse off. So putative examples of free riding: not voting or paying taxes, maybe gaining the benefits of others reducing carbon emissions without reducing one's own, gaining the benefits of others fishing sustainably without reducing one's own take, gaining the benefits of a union contract without paying dues, etc. So modeled like this, when enough people defect, collective action fails and we lose the long-term benefits of cooperating. So in these games, the strategic equilibrium of mutual defection is bad for both of us relative to the cooperative outcome. So solutions that achieve the mutually beneficial outcome usually involve transforming the game, whether by repeating it or allowing agents to correlate their interactions, which allows for the evolution of reciprocity, or else by appeal to an exogenous or dynamic alteration of the incentive structure, for example, through third-party enforcement of laws or norms. Correlation-based and iterative solutions have been explored extensively by biologists and social scientists, and in political philosophy, Hobbes's infamous social contractarian argument in Leviathan for the establishment of the state is largely to transform the payoffs and dilemmas structured like this, particularly as they relate to the regulation of violence, the defense of property, and the enforcement of contracts. The rational choice contractarian approach to ethics similarly offers to sort of pay you the mutual benefits of cooperation as compensation for one's obedience to the moral norms that allow us to trust each other in situations with this structure of material incentives. So the transformed games become structurally similar to this next kind of ideal type, which is what economists following Rousseau call the stag hunt, but all call symbiosis or joint production. So in games of symbiosis or joint production, we can work together to produce our best outcome. In Rousseau's story, cooperatively hunting large game, but each individual can be guaranteed a decent outcome by working alone. So hunting small game or foraging in Rousseau's example. Like the game of pure coordination, interests are aligned and there are two strategic equilibria. From the perspective of the players, the best equilibrium is the cooperative one, which offers both of us a higher payoff, but the risk of our worst outcome if the other player decides to work alone. A worse equilibrium is the outcome in which we both, work alone, where we're both guaranteed a decent but lower payoff. Unlike the invisible foot, however, the cooperative outcome is a stable equilibrium. And it's worth reiterating that most of the transformations of those invisible foot structured games discussed in the literature, repetition, correlated interaction, or altering payoffs end up looking like versions of this one. So in biology, Darwin and then Kropotkin and others emphasize the role of this kind of mutually beneficial cooperation in explaining the evolution of complexity and sociality in the history of life. Lynn Margulis's endosymbiont theory of the evolution of eukaryotes, which inspired Candace Lynn here. This is the idea where free-living prokaryotic mitochondria and chloroplasts join forces with other early prokaryotes by being engulfed by them to result in kind of the eukaryotic cell. That's a notable biological example of symbiosis or joint production, and it's now well confirmed. More speculatively, ambitious theorists of multi-level selection have argued that all of the so-called major transitions in evolutionary history that see the emergence of new forms or levels of individuality, so again, for example, the eukaryotic cell or multicellular organisms, sexual reproduction, or animal societies, evolved through forms of mutually beneficial cooperation. So this kind of once lonely tradition in 20th century biology, which is now arguably kind of ascendant, explains the importance of cooperation as a means in evolutionary history. Kropotkin wrote in 1902 in Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution that, quote, sociability is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle, writing to resist the dominant social Darwinist emphasis on competition. Over 100 years later, Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis wrote A Cooperative Species, Human Reciprocity and Its Evolution, making the plausible argument that humans are such a widespread and evolutionarily successful species precisely because we excel at cooperation in this sense, especially among non-kin and often total strangers. So people share food, resources, and information, elaborate complex systems of group norms, and then some are willing to enforce those norms at a net cost to themselves. This suite of traits that they call, quote, strong reciprocity, willingness to initially cooperate, willingness to cooperate, reciprocal on others' cooperation, and altruistic punishment have been well studied and largely confirmed across cultures, although populations are unsurprisingly heterogeneous. Whether these are virtues of good citizens is, of course, another question, and their evolutionary just so story about these traits' emergence relies on violent intergroup competition in the late Pleistocene, which is hardly politically inspiring stuff. In economics and moral and political philosophy, mutually beneficial cooperative interactions like this and so-called non-zero-sum games, which are more generally situations where mutual benefit is possible, have similarly been used to explain and or justify human institutions requiring trust and joint action, from Adam Smith on the division of labor and exchange in markets to democratic institutions to co-insurance schemes and even just kind of economic activities with increasing returns to scale in general. The liberal political philosopher John Rawls argued that the question of distributive justice arises most fundamentally because we have to figure out some way of divvying up the surplus of an economy conceived as a, quote, cooperative venture for mutual advantage. So in a talk, the late philosopher Charles Mills, in an homage to the comedian Chris Rock, pointed out the absurdity of describing the broad sweep of the history of, say, the actually existing settler colonial US with its racialized genocide, theft of land, and chattel slavery as a, quote, cooperative venture for mutual advantage. Mills asked why this image resonated in the ideal theories of famous white male liberal and libertarian political philosophers, and argued in his paper, Ideal Theory as Ideology, that the abstractions of ideal theory in ethics and political philosophy are not innocent, and indeed they work to uphold the non-ideal. So now I'm getting to Act 2, cooperation as an end, strategic coordination for common good, and I'll kind of start by continuing this critique of this methodologically individualist understanding of cooperation. So first, there are additional epistemological limitations of the methodological individualism kind of inherent in this concept of cooperation. And as Mills argued, related ethical political problems insofar as these models may rationalize oppressive ideologies or obscure actually existing injustices by imagining them to be natural, rational, efficient, or optimal. So epistemologically, induction over the history of the social and biological sciences, as well as the literature on idealized models and philosophy of science, suggests instrumentalist interpretations of them and thus a pragmatic attitude about their use. In economics, Elinor Ostrom showed pretty convincingly that the end player invisible foot or prisoner's dilemma was in many ways an inaccurate empirical model of common pool resource management systems that have successfully avoided the tragedy. Idealizations involved in methodological individualism have also come under fire in biology, as Scott Gilbert and colleagues argue on kind of one extreme that, quote, we have never been individuals, since all complex plants and animals are actually consortia of the macrobe, including endosymbionts and their microbiota. Idealized models, perhaps like the idea that we're individuals, are strictly speaking false, and they're only sometimes useful. So now ideology, since usefulness is also political. So the analytic Marxist tradition demonstrates the logical possibility of conjoining the methodological individualism and these models of game theory with socialist political ethical commitments. But from another Marxist perspective, these idealizations of economic theory themselves are kind of violent abstractions that work to justify oppression and domination. So I think a good case could be made. Mills follows feminist philosophers in criticizing liberalism's idealized models of atomized, independent, rational individual subjects, of course, culturally coded as white men, pursuing their self-interest as in traditional social contract theory. The decontextualization involved in stripping place or locality, history, identity, and power relations, among other real historical, social, and ecological forces from models of human sociality and cooperation is kind of breathtakingly ideological. The rhetoric and imagery of the traditional examples in game theory of cooperation are also striking. So land and multi-species interactions are modeled on extraction, like in the stag hunt, or disorganized competitive scrambles to extract an open access renewable resource or exploit a pollution sink, so the so-called tragedy of the commons. And cooperation is modeled on like nightmare scenarios, like police using the invisible foot to extract confessions from people in cages, the prisoner's dilemma, or Hobbes's invisible foot leading to a violent war of all against all in the absence of the state's coercive power. So more prosaically, these models reduce important questions of political and economic governance to neoliberal mechanism design, the reverse engineering of marginally better outcomes by designing incentives. This usually includes the assumption stated clearly by David Hume and criticized by Bowles and others that institutions ought to be designed for selfish knaves. Interestingly, students of neoclassical economics tend to be less cooperative in behavioral game theory experiments, perhaps because of the field's ruthless methodological and ideological individualism. So on this view, the traditions of thinking cooperation as a means thus represent pessimism about human nature, cynicism about human motivation, and the justification of domination by the state and society via law and social norms. And all of this on the grounds that often only in some very abstract, ideal, or counterfactual sense, we all benefit from these arrangements. Use of concepts of rational choice equilibrium in economics further suggests that social outcomes are natural, rational, or reasonable, as I said earlier. But this narrow concept of cooperation, at least as it's used in social sciences and biology, is value neutral, in the sense that cooperation can in many cases be straightforwardly bad or evil. So successful strategic coordination for mutual benefit between cancer cells, of course, does not benefit the body. And Adam Smith rightly warned about cooperation between private businesses since, quote, the interests of businessmen is always in some respects different from and even opposite to that of the public. So warfare, collusion to fix prices, and punishment for the violation of unjust norms all require cooperation in this narrow sense. Even if it is the case, and I think it's plausible that patriarchy also harms men in some ways, and racism also harms white people in some ways, the policing of heteropatriarchal gender norms or the enforcement of white supremacy also require cooperation in this sense, insofar as these norms tend to uphold systematic advantage. And when used normatively, like in social contract theory, the mutual and mutual benefit usually just represents kind of aggregation, not a more dynamic process constructing a genuinely collective or group interest. So in light of these criticisms, I'll consider some alterations. So an ontologically pluralist, normative, political, ethical conception of cooperation defines it as strategic coordination in pursuit of a common good. And now I'm playing more the conceptual reformer, politician, or engineer. So here, common good should not be understood merely as an aggregation of individual material interests, but rather shared normative commitments or political goals like justice or sustainability, whose meanings must be constructed collectively in their pursuit by cooperators, and whose relations to their material interests are not always straightforward. So cooperation in this sense strikes me as straightforwardly necessary for environmentalist, feminist, anti-racist, or democratic socialist politics that include coalitional allies who materially benefit, sometimes very substantially, from aspects of anthropocentrism, patriarchy, white supremacy, or capitalism. So I'm not only making the point that material interests are not all that matter to this sense of political cooperation, although that's an important premise. The meanings of these common good goals themselves, and particularly what it kind of materially entails to pursue, say, environmental justice, will be essentially contested in application because, as Amartya Sen argues, pursuing justice requires negotiating a plurality of legitimate concerns. So, for example, this is from her book, Resource Radicals, the political scientist Thea Riofrancos discusses the dilemmas of pink tide leftist governments in South America, negotiating between the resource nationalism of the traditional labor left and the anti-extractivism of indigenous environmentalists. So common good goals or values like environmental justice must be constructed and negotiated through social or political processes that facilitate the articulation and prioritization of these different concerns. Cooperation so conceived is a kind of normative meta goal, since successful cooperation entails successful pursuit of a common good even when acting strategically around one's political enemies or adversaries. And I think it's a feature of this notion of cooperation that it allows some formally competitive processes or institutions in which some individuals or groups might not materially benefit in the short term, that is some zero-sum contests, to count as cooperative. So competition as a means on this view is best understood as fundamentally cooperative than as fundamentally competitive, examples here being competitive markets or elections. So strategic coordination in pursuit of a common good may require a wide diversity of institutional structures, but, and so here I'm going to talk a little bit about markets. The neoliberal understanding of competitive markets, specifically as institutions that lack overall goals, should be rejected, not least because markets are currently heading toward a plausibly catastrophic 3 degrees of global warming, and so are in dire need of more governance, planning, and collective goal setting. Indeed, protection of the market from political concern for the common good is what motivated Hayek and the Austrian neoliberal school's use of catalaxy as opposed to economy, as the latter's Greek roots imply a shared goal of, quote, household management. But after decades of failure to meaningfully address the crises and pathologies of capitalism that require investment in long-term infrastructure and public goods, from climate change to pandemics and public health, cooperative household management is perhaps exactly how we ought to conceive of the economy. So getting back to the kind of concept here, by requiring strategic coordination, this sense of cooperation still presumes a sense of autonomy, rejecting the idea that coercion, manipulation, or control of individuals or groups could count as cooperation. The rejection of methodological individualism should not lead to an inflexible methodological holism, but rather to pluralism, along with the understanding that individuals and groups must be co-constituted, and feminist philosophers' insight that autonomy can only be the outcome of a social process of care. So by referring to a common good distinct from aggregate interests, cooperation, I think, can be better understood as a dynamic, creative process involving the articulation and construction of shared goals and values, pointing to the possibility of transforming conditions that define and shape individual material interests conceived kind of narrowly or synchronically or at a single time. So cooperation in this extended, dynamic, multi-scale normative sense, I think, is useful in thinking about coalitions for justice, as I mentioned earlier, but also environmental problems like climate change or biodiversity loss. Since while economists are right, I think that these problems require cooperation in the narrow sense, they would be wrong to suggest they're merely problems of strategic coordination for mutual benefit. And again, I think the spatio-temporal scale and complexity of these problems must involve the cooperative construction and pursuit of shared goals, which is to say a common good. So now I'll say a bit about the Green New Deal and close. So I think the Green New Deal has recently emerged as a model of political cooperation in this kind of extended sense. It has very deeply intertwined goals of justice and sustainability, and especially this idea of a just transition. Proponents of the Green New Deal offer a powerful vision of a deeply cooperative economic and environmental future. In its democratic eco-socialist articulation, this future includes the planned decarbonization of the economy to keep below 1.5 degrees warming, democratization of energy systems and finance, solidarity across international supply chains, fair terms of trade that disrupt ecologically unequal exchange, material reparations and decolonization, including land back for indigenous nations, as well as massive investment in public goods, including abundant green housing and transit, jobs and care work, and ecological restoration, as well as low carbon public luxuries like gardens, parks, pools, gyms, and beaches. But the success of a just transition away from fossil fuels in the time required means building political coalitions across groups like workers in extractive industries or liberals of the global north, whose short-term material interests in some ways align with fossil capital. What proponents of the Green New Deal are urging, from progressive liberal iterations to more eco-socialist visions, is, I think, cooperation as an end, cooperation on projects for articulating and building a common good. And I'll just close with thought from Robin Wall Kimmerer's remarkable book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She suggests drawing from the biology of symbiosis, again, kind of nicely illustrated in this Candace Lynn piece, as well as indigenous knowledge systems. So she suggests that all flourishing is mutual. So in a nutshell, I've argued that the recognition of the ecological and social embeddedness of the individual should lead us to question concepts of cooperation that idealize this context away. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to the discussion.